In the crystal spires of Zephyr Prime, where mathematics was religion and equations were prayers, the grand computational assembly had been wrestling with the same problem for 3 generations. The towering structures of pure silicon and quantum glass stretched toward the amber sky, their surfaces covered in ever-changing mathematical theorems that glowed with bioluminescent intensity. Here, in the heart of the Zephyrian homeworld, the galaxy's most revered mathematicians pursued knowledge with the fervor of zealots. The Zephyrians, with their 4-lobed brains and crystalline neural networks, prided themselves on being the galaxy's greatest mathematicians. Their society was built upon numerical perfection, every building calculated to precise mathematical ratios, every citizen's name derived from prime number sequences, every daily ritual timed according to complex algorithms that had been refined over millennia. High mathematician Velthera stood before the massive holographic display in the central computation chamber, her silver-scaled hands tracing complex symbols in the air. The equation floated before her like a living thing, thousands of variables, interdimensional matrices, and quantum probability functions that seemed to mock every attempt at solution. The hologram stretched across the entire chamber, its blue-white light casting dancing shadows on the crystalline walls. The fundamental convergence theorem, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades of failure. The key to understanding dark matter distribution across galactic clusters. This equation had become more than a mathematical problem, it had evolved into a sacred quest that defined their entire civilization. Zephyrian children learned its basic components before they could speak. Philosophers debated its deeper meanings. Artists created sculptures inspired by its elegant curves and infinite complexity. Her assistant, young Crickstar, approached with reverent steps, his neural crystals flickering with nervous energy. At barely 60 standard years old, he was considered a mathematical prodigy, yet even he felt inadequate in the presence of this legendary problem. High mathematician, the council grows impatient. Perhaps we should consider abandoning this pursuit. Velthera's 4 eyes blazed with indignation, their pupils dilating to show the deep purple that indicated intense emotion among her people. Abandon? 3 generations of our finest minds have dedicated their lives to this equation. My grandfather, Velthram the Wise, began this work with 17 of the greatest mathematicians in our history. My father, Velthok the Persistent, continued it with machines that could calculate faster than thought itself. I will not be the one to surrender. She gestured toward the memorial wall where crystalline tablets bore the names of 47 mathematicians who had died while working on the theorem, some from exhaustion, others from the madness that came from staring too long into mathematical infinity. The equation pulsed with ethereal light, its complexity a beautiful nightmare that had consumed the brightest minds of their species. Each variable represented years of research, each matrix a lifetime of contemplation. The Zephyrians had built their entire identity around this single, unsolvable problem. Besides, Velthera added, her voice softening as she gazed at the hypnotic display, what would we be without the great equation? It has driven our advancement for 147 years. It has made us who we are. Little did she know that in a distant spiral arm of the galaxy, on a small blue planet called Earth, a mathematician named Marcus Webb was about to challenge everything the Zephyrians believed about complexity, dedication, and the nature of mathematical truth itself. The diplomatic vessel Harmony descended through Earth's atmosphere like a falling star, its crystalline hull reflecting the morning sunlight as it approached the landing pad at the International Xenological Institute in Geneva. The ship's geometry was impossibly perfect, every angle calculated to mathematical precision, every surface reflecting light in patterns that would have made human artists weep with envy. Ambassador Velthera and her scientific entourage emerged from the vessel with ceremonial dignity, their ornate robes embedded with computational crystals that pulsed with soft blue light. Each crystal represented decades of mathematical achievement, and their synchronized flickering created complex patterns that told the story of Zephyrian intellectual superiority. The delegation moved with the measured steps of beings who calculated the optimal stride length for maximum efficiency. The Zephyrians had reluctantly agreed to this cultural exchange program after decades of galactic diplomatic pressure. Privately, they considered humans to be little more than primitive primates who had stumbled into space travel through sheer accident rather than mathematical elegance. Their preliminary reports described Earth's mathematics as charmingly rudimentary and suitable for basic computational tasks. Dr. Marcus Webb, Earth's lead xenomathematician, greeted them at the landing pad with characteristic human informality. His unruly brown hair looked like he'd stuck his finger in an electrical socket, and his casual demeanor immediately struck the Zephyrians as deeply unprofessional. Where they wore ornate robes that cost more than most humans made in a year, he wore a simple button-down shirt with a coffee stain that resembled the constellation Orion. "Welcome to Earth," Marcus called out, jogging toward them with a grin that showed too many teeth. "I'm Dr. Webb, but just call me Marcus. I'm absolutely thrilled to learn from your mathematical traditions." Velthara's translator unit struggled with the human's casual tone and enthusiastic inflection. Among Zephyrians, mathematics was discussed with the solemnity of a funeral rite, each word carefully chosen and precisely enunciated. This human spoke of their sacred art like he was discussing the weather. "Dr. Webb," Velthara replied through her translator, her voice carrying the formal cadence of diplomatic protocol, "we appreciate your enthusiasm. Perhaps you could show us your computational facilities." Marcus led them across the campus, chattering constantly about Earth's mathematical history, completely oblivious to the Zephyrians' horrified expressions. He pointed out various buildings with the casual air of a tour guide, occasionally stopping to greet colleagues or pet a campus dog that had wandered into their path. "Oh, and this is where Euler worked on his famous theorem. Well, not literally, but you get the idea." Marcus laughed at his own joke while the Zephyrians exchanged bewildered glances. They arrived at his office in the mathematics department, a cramped space on the third floor of a building that looked like it had been constructed by someone who had never heard of architectural mathematics. The Zephyrians stared in absolute horror at the chaos within, papers scattered everywhere like the aftermath of a tornado, coffee cups being used as paperweights, and an ancient whiteboard covered in half-erased equations that looked like a mathematical graveyard. Books were stacked in precarious towers that defied structural engineering, and somewhere in the mess, a half-eaten sandwich peeked out from beneath a pile of research papers. The air smelled of coffee, chalk dust, and what might have been desperation. "This is your sacred space?" Krixtar whispered in barely concealed disbelief, his neural crystals flickering rapidly as he tried to process the organizational nightmare before him. "Oh, this old thing?" Marcus gestured around the chaos with obvious affection. "Yeah, I do my best thinking here. The mess helps me focus. Don't ask me why." "Coffee?" The formal presentation took place in the university's main conference room, a sterile space that the Zephyrians had deemed adequately professional, despite its lack of computational crystals or mathematical murals. The room was packed with Earth's finest mathematicians, physicists, and xenologists, all eager to witness this historic exchange of knowledge between species. During the lengthy introduction ceremony, Velthara decided to demonstrate the vast intellectual gulf between their civilizations by presenting the humans with the fundamental convergence theorem. She had planned this moment carefully. It would be a gentle but firm reminder of Zephyrian superiority, a way to establish the proper hierarchy before they began their educational exchange. With practice ceremony, she activated her portable holoprojector, a device that cost more than most human universities' entire annual budgets. The machine hummed with quantum resonance as it filled the conference room with the magnificent complexity of their unsolved equation. The hologram expanded like a living constellation, its thousands of variables dancing in three-dimensional space with hypnotic beauty. The human mathematicians gasped appropriately at the display, their faces illuminated by the blue-white glow of mathematical perfection. Some fumbled for their primitive recording devices, while others simply stared in slack-jawed amazement. This was exactly the reaction Velthara had hoped for. "Esteemed colleagues," she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition, "this represents the culmination of Zephyrian mathematical achievement. Behold the fundamental convergence theorem, the equation that will unlock the secrets of dark matter distribution across galactic clusters. Our greatest minds have spent 147 years attempting to solve this elegant masterpiece." The hologram pulsed with ethereal light, its complexity so beautiful that several humans had tears in their eyes. Variables flowed into matrices that transformed into probability functions that cascaded into dimensional analyses that seemed to go on forever. It was mathematics as art, as philosophy, as the very essence of existence itself. Dr. Marcus Webb, however, seemed oddly distracted. While his colleagues sat in reverent silence, he was fishing around in his jacket pocket with the casual air of someone looking for his car keys. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but not at the magnificent display before him. He seemed to be searching for something mundane. 147 years? Marcus mumbled, finally extracting a crumpled napkin from his pocket. The same one he'd used to wipe his mouth after lunch at the campus coffee shop. The napkin bore the faded logo of Joe's Java Joint and had a small mustard stain near one corner. "Mind if I take a look?" The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically. The other humans turned to stare at Marcus with expressions ranging from embarrassment to horror. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the department head, cleared her throat loudly in a desperate attempt to restore decorum. Velthara's scales rippled with barely contained condescension, her 4 eyes narrowing as she processed this incredible breach of protocol. "Dr. Webb, I hardly think a piece of refuse from your feeding establishment would be appropriate for it." But Marcus was already moving, completely oblivious to the diplomatic crisis he was creating. He approached the holographic display with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to be intimidated by complexity. His ballpoint pen, a cheap plastic thing that probably cost less than a Zephyrian's morning meal, was already in his hand. "Interesting approach you've taken here," he muttered, squinting at the swirling equations while occasionally pausing to sip from his ever-present coffee cup. "Very thorough." The word thorough hung in the air like an insult, though Marcus seemed unaware of its impact on the assembled aliens. Marcus held up the napkin with the casual pride of someone who had just figured out a crossword puzzle, completely oblivious to the mathematical earthquake he was about to trigger. The crumpled piece of paper, now covered in what appeared to be elementary algebra mixed with coffee ring stains, looked absolutely ridiculous next to the magnificent holographic display that had taken generations to construct. "I think there's a fundamental error in your foundational assumptions," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to point out that someone had their shoes on the wrong feet. "See, you're treating this as a multidimensional matrix problem, but it's really just a variation of the quadratic formula." The silence in the room was so complete that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring waterfall. Dr. Warren's face had gone pale, while her colleagues looked like they were witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. The Zephyrian delegation stood frozen, their neural crystals flickering in patterns that suggested severe computational strain. Velthara's 4 eyes widened in shock, her pupils dilating to their maximum extent, a biological response that hadn't occurred since her childhood encounter with a mathematical paradox. "The quadratic formula," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That primitive computational method from your species' elementary education?" "Well, yeah," Marcus continued, apparently mistaking her horror for genuine interest. "It's basically x superscript 2 plus bx plus c equals 0, right? The foundation of solving second-degree polynomial equations. We teach it to 14-year-olds. He turned the napkin around so the assembled crowd could see his work, pointing with his cheap pen at scribbles that looked like they belonged on a high school student's homework rather than in a diplomatic conference. "Look here. If you substitute x for your dark matter variable and simplify these quantum probability functions by removing the unnecessary complexity layers, you get this basic relationship." The Zephyrians leaned forward despite themselves, their advanced minds struggling to process what they were seeing. The human had taken their sacred equation, their masterpiece of mathematical architecture, and reduced it to something that could fit on a piece of trash. "You see, you've been adding all these beautiful but unnecessary transformations," Marcus continued, his pen tracing simple lines on the napkin. "It's like, imagine you want to know how much paint you need for a wall. You could calculate the molecular structure of the paint, the quantum interactions between pigments, the thermodynamic properties of the surface, or you could just measure the wall and multiply length times width." Crickstar's neural crystals had begun flickering so rapidly they looked like a strobe light. His voice came out as a strangled whisper, but the elegance, the mathematical poetry. "Oh, it's still elegant," Marcus assured him cheerfully. "Sometimes the most elegant solution is the simplest one. The answer to your fundamental convergence theorem is approximately 42.738 recurring, with a margin of error of plus or minus 0.003. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. For nearly 3 minutes, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The Zephyrians' mental processes seemed to have frozen entirely, while the humans looked like they were watching their colleague juggle live grenades. Finally, Crickstar's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Hi, mathematician. I believe he may be correct." Velthara's proud composure, maintained through decades of mathematical failures and diplomatic challenges, finally cracked like an eggshell. Her silver scales had shifted to a deep purple, the Zephyrian equivalent of a complete emotional breakdown. That's impossible," she whispered. "Our greatest minds have spent their entire lives Our most advanced quantum computers, 3 generations of dedicated research. Marcus, apparently sensing the emotional devastation he had inadvertently caused, attempted to lighten the mood with characteristic human awkwardness. Hey, don't feel bad about it. Sometimes you just need fresh eyes, you know? Want to grab some pizza? I know this great place that does mathematical theorems on the crust. Just kidding about that last part. The crumpled napkin fluttered to the conference table like a fallen leaf, carrying with it the weight of a civilization's shattered pride. Back aboard the Harmony, the Zephyrian delegation worked with desperate frenzy to verify Marcus's solution. The ship's central computation chamber, normally a place of serene mathematical contemplation, had transformed into a scene of barely controlled chaos. Their quantum computers hummed with desperate energy, processing calculations at frequencies that threatened to overload their crystalline cores. Velthera stood at the center of it all, her silver scales now a mottled pattern of purple and gray, colors that indicated profound psychological distress among her people. The napkin sat on the command pedestal like a sacred relic, its coffee stains and casual scribbles looking obscene against the backdrop of their most advanced computational equipment. "Run the simulation again," she commanded, her voice hoarse from hours of continuous operation. "Check every variable. Cross-reference with the Galactic Dark Matter database. There must be an error." The ship's AI, a quantum consciousness that had been calculating for over 2 centuries, responded with what could only be described as electronic bewilderment. "Hi, mathematician, I have run the human's solution through our most sophisticated verification protocols. The calculations are correct. The fundamental convergence theorem yields an answer of 42.738 recurring, exactly as the human specified." Crickstar, who had been frantically checking and rechecking the math on 17 different computational matrices, finally collapsed into his meditation pod. His neural crystals had dimmed to a faint amber glow, the Zephyrian equivalent of exhausted acceptance. The margin of error calculations are also precise. His confidence interval of plus or minus 0.003 is accurate to 12 decimal places. Dr. Lydia Foster, Marcus's colleague who had accompanied the delegation back to the ship, watched the alien breakdown with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. As a xenopsychologist, she had studied alien cultures for decades, but she had never witnessed an entire species' worldview crumble in real time. "How?" Velthera turned to her, scales rippling with patterns that Lydia's cultural database identified as desperate pleading. "How did he see what we could not? We have minds specifically evolved for mathematical complexity. Our neural architecture is designed for processing multidimensional calculations. We have quantum computers that can simulate entire galaxies." Lydia chose her words carefully, aware that she was dealing with beings whose entire identity had just been shattered. "Marcus has this gift for seeing patterns, but more importantly, he doesn't get bogged down in complexity. He always looks for the simplest solution first. We have a saying, Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one." "But the elegance of our approach," Velthera protested, gesturing at the holographic displays that showed their beautiful, intricate, utterly wrong methodology. "The mathematical poetry, the dimensional harmonics, the quantum resonance matrices, surely these add meaning to the solution?" "Sometimes the most beautiful solution is the simplest one," Lydia said gently, then immediately regretted her choice of words as she watched Velthera's scales shift to an even deeper shade of purple. The ship's AI interjected with devastating precision. "High mathematician, analysis indicates that our elaborate methodology actually obscured the solution. We created mathematical complexity where none was needed. The human's approach strips away unnecessary layers to reveal the fundamental relationship." Crickstar, who had been silent throughout the verification process, finally spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "High mathematician, what do we tell the council? How do we explain that a human, using primitive tools and elementary mathematics, solved in minutes what we couldn't solve in decades?" Velthera stared at the napkin, her 4 eyes unfocused as she processed the full implications. Their entire civilization was built on the assumption of mathematical superiority. Their social hierarchy, their educational system, their very sense of identity, all of it was predicated on being the galaxy's greatest mathematicians. I don't know," she whispered, the words barely audible above the hum of the quantum computers that had failed her so completely. "I don't know." The napkin continued to sit on the command pedestal, its casual scribbles mocking centuries of Zephyrian mathematical achievement. In the growing silence, the ship's AI began running probability calculations on the likelihood of a complete cultural paradigm shift, its electronic consciousness trying to process the impossible that sometimes the most advanced solution was the simplest one. The news spread through the Zephyrian scientific community like a quantum cascade reaction, rippling across their homeworld's crystal networks faster than their most advanced communication systems. Within hours, every mathematician, physicist, and computational theorist on Zephyr Prime knew the impossible truth: their greatest unsolved equation had been cracked by a human with a napkin. The Grand Computational Assembly convened an emergency session in the sacred chamber of numbers, its crystalline walls pulsing with agitated bioluminescence that reflected the collective emotional turmoil of the assembled minds. For the first time in recorded history, the chamber's perfect mathematical harmonies were disrupted by the chaos of argument, denial, and gradual, devastating acceptance. Elder mathematician Zephran, whose crystalline neural crown marked him as one of the most revered computational minds in their history, stood before the assembly with scales that flickered between deep purple confusion and silver determination. At nearly 400 standard years old, he had spent his entire life believing in the supremacy of Zephyrian mathematical methodology. Fellow seekers of numerical truth, his voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic equations. We stand at a crossroads that challenges the very foundation of our civilization. The evidence is undeniable, verified by our most advanced systems and confirmed by independent calculation matrices across 17 research institutes. The assembled mathematicians rustled with nervous energy, their computational crystals creating a symphony of anxious flickering that painted the chamber walls in shifting patterns of uncertainty. We have spent generations perfecting our approach to mathematical problems, Zephran continued, his four eyes scanning the crowd of brilliant minds that had devoted their lives to complexity. We created elaborate theoretical frameworks, multidimensional analytical systems, and quantum computational matrices of breathtaking sophistication. We turned mathematics into art, into philosophy, into religion. A young mathematician named Valkyra stood from her contemplation pod, her voice trembling with barely contained heresy. Elder, perhaps we have been approaching mathematics incorrectly? The chamber fell silent, the suggestion hanging in the air like a blasphemous equation that threatened to divide by zero. Zephran's neural crown dimmed as he processed this fundamental challenge to everything they believed. Perhaps, he said slowly, each word carrying the weight of paradigm shift, we have been so focused on making mathematics sacred and complex that we've forgotten its fundamental purpose: to describe reality simply and elegantly. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Marcus Webb continued his normal routine with the blissful ignorance of someone who had accidentally triggered an interstellar philosophical crisis. He attended his regular Tuesday morning calculus class, explaining basic derivatives to freshmen who were more interested in checking their phones than understanding mathematical beauty. He graded papers in his chaotic office, drinking coffee from a mug that proclaimed world's most average mathematician. When a reporter from the Global Science Network finally tracked him down for an interview about his breakthrough, Marcus looked genuinely confused. Pausing in his explanation of integration by parts to stare at the camera crew that had invaded his classroom. "What breakthrough?" he asked, chalk still in hand and equations half finished on the ancient blackboard behind him. "I just pointed out that they were overcomplicating things. It's like using calculus to figure out that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Sometimes the obvious answer is actually the right answer." The reporter, expecting profound insights into the nature of mathematical discovery, pressed for more details. "But Dr. Webb, you solved in minutes what the galaxy's greatest mathematicians couldn't solve in decades. Surely you must have some insight into—" "Look," Marcus interrupted, turning back to his blackboard with characteristic impatience. "I've got 18-year-olds who need to understand why the derivative of x squared is 2x. That's way more important than whatever those crystal-headed folks were working on. Math isn't supposed to be mystical. It's supposed to be useful." Back on Zephyr Prime, the paradigm shift was swift and unprecedented. The assembly established the Webb Institute for Simplified Mathematics within hours of the emergency session's conclusion. They dispatched their brightest young minds, including Crickstar, to study under human mathematicians, with specific instructions to learn the art of thinking small rather than thinking complex. The irony was not lost on Elder Zephran as he authorized the cultural exchange programs. A species that had evolved four-lobed brains specifically for handling mathematical complexity was now sending its children to learn simplicity from beings whose greatest computational achievement had been landing on their own moon. A year later, the transformation was complete and utterly unprecedented in galactic history. Ambassador Velthora returned to Earth, but this time her crystalline robes had been replaced with simple academic attire, a button-down shirt, and practical slacks that wouldn't have looked out of place in any human university. Her computational crystals, once symbols of mathematical superiority, now hung dormant around her neck like historical artifacts. She sat in Marcus's cramped office as a student rather than a dignitary, watching him solve complex differential equations with the same casual ease he'd shown that first day. The chaos around them had somehow become comforting, the scattered papers, the precariously stacked books, the coffee rings on every available surface. What had once seemed like mathematical blasphemy now felt like authentic workspace. Dr. Webb, she said, her voice carrying none of the formal cadence that had once marked her as diplomatic elite, I must ask, how did you know to look for the simple solution? What gave you the insight to strip away centuries of our carefully constructed complexity? Marcus paused in his calculations, setting down his cheap ballpoint pen and leaning back in his creaky office chair. A year of working with Zephyrian students had taught him to be more thoughtful about his explanations, though his fundamental approach remained unchanged. My grandmother used to say something that stuck with me, he replied, gesturing toward a faded photograph on his desk showing an elderly woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. She'd tell me, Marcus, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. She was a baker, not a mathematician, but she understood something fundamental about complexity. He stood and walked to his ancient whiteboard, where equations from 3 different classes still competed for space in a palimpsest of mathematical knowledge. When she taught me to bake bread, she could have explained the complex chemistry of gluten formation, the thermodynamics of yeast metabolism, the molecular structure of starches, all fascinating stuff. Instead, she showed me that flour plus water plus time equals bread. Everything else was just details. Velthora's scales shimmered with what humans had learned was Zephyrian laughter, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. We spent centuries making mathematics into a religion when it should have remained a tool for understanding the universe. Hey, nothing wrong with finding beauty in complexity, Marcus said, returning to his work with characteristic humility. Some of the most beautiful things in the universe are incredibly complex, symphonies, ecosystems, the way light bends around black holes. But the underlying principles? Those should be simple enough that anyone can grasp them. Outside the window, a remarkable scene was unfolding that would have been impossible to imagine just a year ago. Young Zephyrian students could be seen gathered around cafe tables, their silver scales glinting in the afternoon sunlight as they hunched over napkins and scratch paper instead of quantum computers. They practiced the distinctly human art of rough work and good enough solutions, learning to value approximation over precision, insight over elaboration. Crickstar sat among them, his neural crystals dim as he worked through basic calculus problems with the focused intensity of someone discovering a new language. Beside him, a human freshman explained the concept of limits using hand gestures and coffee-stained notebook paper, their casual collaboration bridging billions of years of evolutionary divergence. You know what's funny? Marcus continued, oblivious to the historical significance of the scene outside. The more I work with your people, the more I realize we're not that different. We all want to understand how things work. We all get frustrated when the answers don't come easily. The only difference is that you folks thought complexity was the goal when really it's just one possible path. In the grand computational assembly on Zephyr Prime, the fundamental convergence theorem had finally been marked as solved, not by their most sophisticated quantum computers or their most elaborate theoretical frameworks, but by a coffee-stained napkin that now hung in a place of honor within a specially constructed preservation matrix. The napkin had become more than a mathematical solution, it was a symbol of intellectual humility, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths hide in plain sight. Beneath it, a simple brass plaque bore an inscription in both Zephyrian script and human English: the universe explains itself to those who listen with simple hearts. Elder Zephyran visited the memorial daily, his ancient neural crown flickering with patterns that younger Zephyrians had learned to recognize as wonder rather than confusion. The greatest mathematical mind of his generation had discovered something more valuable than any equation: the wisdom to know when less was more. And in the end, that simple recognition that elegance often wore the clothes of simplicity had changed not just how two species approached mathematics, but how they understood the fundamental nature of discovery itself.